Hello, I'm Esme Murphy, and welcome to Talking Points. With all the attention on ICE raids in Minneapolis these days, something has been lost. The fact that these ICE raids are actually happening all across the state. As Senator Amy Klobuchar said in the aftermath of Alex Preddy's killing, this is happening everywhere. It's way beyond Minneapolis, way beyond St. Paul. And joining me to talk about that is Gary Wertish, who is the president of the Minnesota Farmers Union, 18,000 members strong. They've been a proud organization in Minnesota since the 1900s. Thank you so much, Gary, for coming on.
Yep, thank you, Esme. Glad to try and help.
Well, I want to hear just from you, and because I know that you have been out front. It just has not gotten a lot of attention, but what has been the impact of this operation? It's not Metro Surge where you are, but it's a surge where you have been too, where farmers are.
Well, it's really had a big effect. You know, we've heard reports of a processing plants. We heard a report this morning of one processing plant within Minnesota that doesn't have enough workers to operate their plant, and there's days they're shut down. So it's definitely having an effect. You know, and obviously the big focus has been in Minneapolis, but it's really spread out throughout the state. And you know, unfortunately, the restaurant industry they've really been hit hard because you got a lot of workers that are afraid to go out of their homes, even though they're legal workers. And that we've seen reports of restaurants closed throughout the state of Minnesota. It's not just in the metro area. In the rural communities, there's a lot of primarily Latino or people of color restaurants that are being closed primarily for the even though they're legal workers, the workers are afraid to go out of their homes. So I mean, that's just that part is just plain terrible. But it's had an effect. You know, farmers, we supply food, but it's going to have a long-term effect too, because it's going to affect whether it's a processing plant now or farmers that need to have some H-2A workers or some immigrant workers coming in and helping them this coming spring. It's going to have an effect because are they going to be able to get them workers? It's always been a struggle getting workers on time. This is going to make it even worse. So it's going to have the supply chain all the way down the line. It's not just Minneapolis. It's far-reaching effect all of agriculture through our whole economy.
And yeah, well, I want to say the reason that I'm talking to you is because I think it's so important to explain this. We did cover a case where ICE agents ate at a restaurant, a Mexican restaurant in Wilmer, and they had lunch there, and then they followed the workers home and arrested them. And I know that the Wilmer community was concerned about that. I want to ask, you mentioned the long-term concern. Obviously, we are in the dead of winter at the moment. But in terms of hiring workers, since the 1990s, people who are undocumented have been able to come to this country and pay taxes legally. That's a system that you use, I know. Is there concern that there will not be enough workers? I think you sort of voiced that. And also, how do you plan for that as a farmer?
Well, that's the part that's really going to it's going to be a challenge, because at this point, with all this uncertainty and what is happening, if you're an immigrant worker that comes from another country that comes here legally to do that on a H-2A or some type of work visa, and you're going to probably look elsewhere. And even, the focus has really been heavy on Minnesota. Are you going to try and go to another state where there's a job available? So this is, and really it's they're focused on Minnesota now, but it seems to be spread out into other states too. So this is going to be very damaging. There's other places in the world that, people can go and do a short time work too. So, I think there's no disagreement. A hardened criminal needs to be prosecuted, but the way this is happening, it's just hitting everybody very indiscriminately.
Well, and so your point basically is these workers who want to earn money for their families will probably go to Kansas or even Iowa.
Right, very much so. Or there's a lot more undocumented workers in Texas and Florida, for example, and there's no focus on those states at all. And if you're a documented worker from another country, or say Mexico, right on the south of us, you certainly would be looking at those states where you feel you're still going to have some apprehension, but you might certainly feel more secure going to a state like that.
Is this going to affect farmers' bottom line, this inability to plan, this uncertainty of how many workers they have? Could this affect how much they plant, how much, obviously, work they have, and also ultimately the consumer who depends on the wonderful Minnesota produce?
Well, it'll definitely, and as he just said, it ultimately, this all reflects, it'll hit the consumer. The consumer will be paying, the brunt of this. And, it obviously will affect the farmers too. Whether you can, if you rely on a certain amount of workforce to get your work done. And if you can't get that's going to be a challenge. Will they be able to, will your yield suffer? Or, if you're a vegetable farmer, will you be able to plant less? It's so many uncertainties in this, but ultimately this all will fall back on the American consumer, because it's going to affect everything. As right now, you had the restaurants industry shutting down for quite a bit of it, and it's all food that the farmers produce. That's all of a sudden there's no market for it.
And when you say it's going to affect American consumers, is it going to affect consumers here in Minnesota more, because presumably in other states they will be able to have these workers?
Yeah, it's hard to say at this point. I would expect it will at some point, but as I said earlier, there's so much uncertainty. We don't really know the exact faults of what's going to hit. Yeah.
Let me ask you, I know that there's been a lot of focus by ICE in the Mankato area. Where else have you heard about real problems for farmers?
Well, I know there's a number of, even your conventional farmers, let's say your corn and soybean or livestock farmers, they use a lot of, there's certain entities that use a lot of documented workers to get their product, whether it's taking care of the livestock or doing the crops. So, all of a sudden, if you're short workers, it's going to be very hard to do that. And then the workers you have left, you're going to be overworking them, and to get the, if it's livestock, the animals still got to be fed, or if it's dairy, they got to be milked. And then if it's crops, it's very timely on how you get your work done, and it's going to be hard. Put another work, will you be able to get it done on time, or will it result in a poorer quality crop, or we just don't know.
I know that a number of months ago, President Trump, said that he was concerned about the situation with farmers, and that he was going to basically kind of go easier on the farm population. I'm paraphrasing now, but he certainly suggested that. Has that happened in Minnesota? Have you seen any easing at all, or is this just because it's Minnesota, there is this focus?
No, I haven't seen any easing. We haven't seen any easing on the farmers. It seems like they're just indiscriminately, and and we have to be honest with each other. It seems like this is more politically driven than anything. It's more about getting numbers, and that's unfortunate. It's getting the numbers, whether they're legal or not. It doesn't seem to make any difference how we've all seen the videos on how they're just grabbing people indiscriminately, and that's unfortunate, and certainly it is affecting the farmers. We, like I said earlier, I know of a few processing plants. These are livestock processing plants that haven't been able to have their whole workforce, and in some cases they've had to shut down for a day because they don't have enough workers to run their plants. So that's causing. It's causing long-term damage to our supply chains too. You back up, a lot of these plants are scheduled to run their animals through, and then all of a sudden, if you can't operate at full speed, it creates a backlog.
Well, let me ask you this. President Trump wouldn't be president without the votes of Minnesota farmers. Well, actually, Minnesota ended up going for Kamala Harris, but there were a lot of Minnesota farmers that voted for him, and certainly across the country. It was farmers who were one of his biggest constituencies who helped put him in the White House. What are farmers thinking? Very true. What are farmers thinking now?
Well, that's a good question. I know the farmers did a lot of the majority of farmers that did vote for him. They fell into that. They believe that, well, he'll take care of us again. That and the tariffs is a good example of what's happening. In his first term, he did the tariffs, and we never recovered our market to China as we had before he put the tariffs on. And now he's made what's called a framework deal with China. Well, actually, China agreed to purchase less soybeans in the President Trump's new trade agreement. They've actually agreed to purchase more or less soybeans than they were purchasing the last couple of years. So that has damage, and now with his fantasy of taking over Greenland with the European countries, that we had some agreement there, and now the European leaders are kind of putting a pause on that too. So it's just the chaos with the president wanting to use tariffs as he thinks he said it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary or something to that extent, but that is causing long-term damage. And as we in Minnesota and the United States, we know we need to trade because we're fortunate enough to produce more than we can consume domestically, whether it's livestock or crops. So we do need to trade. We all understand that, but with the president with his chaos and changing his mind from day to day on the tariffs and using tariffs as his big stick, we're losing our trust as a reliable trading partner, and that's going to take a long time. That'll take decades to recover that. And you got Canada as an example, signing a trade agreement with China now, bypassing the United States because they've already said they don't view the U.S. as a reliable trading partner.
Well, it sounds like the immigration policies are also affecting farmers as well. Certainly the tariffs are. That's a whole nother subject and a whole nother show we'll have to have you back on. But we certainly want our Minnesota farmers to do well. We all do. And I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Esme. And it goes back to, the president you mentioned earlier, they got to check, and now they'll get a $12 billion payment to the farmers to help out. That's nowhere near covers the losses that the farmers are experiencing. But the other side of it is it right for the U.S. taxpayer to keep paying that money to farmers? When a lot of this is created by the president's own policy. So that's not justifiable. And as a farmer, we can't justify just getting payments from, when the government, in this case, is really taking a lot of our market share away from us.
And what you're talking about is the fact that President Trump has worked out programs to aid farmers and to give money, and obviously it's taxpayer money ultimately, whereas I think what you're saying is that most farmers would rather be planting their crops and selling them.
Well, exactly. Yeah, we want our money from the marketplace, and I said, rather than from the government. All farmers want that, and it's hard to justify that. There's other parts of the industry, other consumers that are suffering too. But it's hard to justify the farmer getting a payment on it. Obviously, the payment is the need is there. There's no no disagreement on that, but it's hard to justify.
Well, Gary Wertish, president of the Minnesota Farmers Union, 18,000 members strong in Minnesota. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yep, thank you, Esme. Good to talk to you.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, feel free to email me with comments or suggestions at esme@cbs.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.